Millionaire catches Jewish boy dancing with his paralyzed daughter. What he did next shocked all. "Get that Jewish kid out of here now or I'll call the police," shouted Helena Morrison, a millionaire neighbor, pointing her finger accusingly at the 12-year-old boy who was dancing in the Goldman family garden. "That creature is disturbing my sick daughter." David Goldman, a 45-year-old businessman and owner of one of the largest construction companies in the city, stopped in the middle of the road when he heard the screams coming from his property. Through the window of the neighboring mansion, he could see Helena filming everything with her cell phone, clearly preparing some kind of complaint. In the center of the garden, her daughter Sophie, 8 years old and paralyzed in her legs since an accident 2 years ago, was laughing for the first time in months. In her wheelchair, she clapped her hands while the boy Eli Cohen, son of the new neighbors, performed a traditional Jewish dance he had learned in synagogue. "Daddy, he's teaching me a special dance," cried Sophie, turning her chair in small circles, trying to keep up with the boy's movements. "Look how I can move." Helena Morrison was not at all interested in the girl's joy. "David, control this situation. My guests from the tennis club are arriving in an hour and I won't tolerate this spectacle in my neighborhood." The 52-year-old woman, former president of the Residents Association and known for her firm opinions on who should live in decent neighborhoods, had moved into the condominium 3 years ago. Since then, she had made a point of documenting every irregularity she could find, especially when it involved families who didn't fit into her ideal neighborhood pattern. David watched the scene for a few more seconds. Sophie hadn't smiled like this since before the accident. Eli, sensing the tension, stopped dancing and lowered his head, clearly used to this kind of reaction. "I'm sorry, Mr. Goldman," murmured the boy. "I just wanted to make your daughter smile." In the synagogue, they teach that making someone's heart happy is a mitzvah. A-M-I-T-Z what? Helena practically spat out the words. "I don't want your weird traditions anywhere near my property. David, are you going to allow them to influence your daughter with this culture?" The dismissive tone with which she pronounced the word culture made something stir in David's chest. It was the same tone his grandfather Isaac described when he told him about his neighbors in Berlin in 1938, who suddenly began to worry about the Jewish presence in the neighborhood. It was at that moment that David Goldman realized he was facing something much bigger than a simple argument between neighbors. Helena had revealed exactly who she was underneath all that facade of social elite. Sophie held Eli's hand tightly. "Daddy, he's my friend. Why is she being mean?" There were tears forming in her eyes, not of sadness, but of genuine confusion as to why someone would be cruel to her only friend. David had spent the last 2 years watching his daughter waste away emotionally after the accident. Doctors, therapists, psychologists, nothing had managed to bring back the spark in his eyes. Until that moment. Until Eli showed up with his simple dance and his pure heart. "And another thing," Helena continued, now pointing directly at Sophie, "this girl needs to understand that there are appropriate places for certain activities. I'm not going to have my property devalued by that kind of behavior." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Helena filming, clearly documenting everything to use as evidence later. David watched Eli's eyes. There was a resignation there that number 12-year-old should carry. "Mom always says that some people don't like us," Eli whispered to Sophie, trying to comfort his friend even though he was clearly hurt. "But it's not our fault. It's just like this." Something in the businessman's expression changed. A dangerous calm took over his face as he walked slowly towards the fence separating the properties. His upright posture and measured steps were less like a businessman and more like a general preparing for a battle he had waited his whole life to fight. "Helena," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the neighbor stop filming for a second. "I don't think you understand the situation." Actually, it was Helena Morrison who didn't understand the situation. She had no idea that David Goldman wasn't just a successful businessman. He was someone who had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about concentration camps. Someone who perfectly recognized the tone and words she had just heard. And above all, she didn't know that she was dealing with a man who had promised himself that he would never allow that kind of hatred to touch his family again. A man who had built an empire not just out of ambition, but as a shield against exactly that kind of ignorance. What Helena also didn't know was that David Goldman had resources, connections and a strategic patience that had been forged by generations of survivors. And that, for the first time in years, someone had given him a reason to use it all. If you're enjoying this story of how prejudice can awaken a force that was only sleeping, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a determined father can turn injustice into a lesson that a racist neighbor will never forget. Helena, he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the neighbor stop filming for a second. I don't think you understand the situation. Oh, I understand perfectly. Helena laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. I understand that you people like you think you can move to decent neighborhoods and bring your traditions here. She practically spat out the word traditions, as if it were something nauseating. David watched in silence as Helena continued her venomous rant, each word revealing deeper layers of her prejudice. Sophie had stopped smiling and now looked confusedly between the adults, her small hand still holding Eli's. My daughter is recovering from an accident, David said calmly. Eli is the first person in 2 years who has managed to make her smile. I thought that would be something any civilized neighbor would celebrate. Helena let out a cruel laugh. Civilized? David, you need to understand that this condominium has certain expectations. We can't have children performing strange rituals in the gardens. What will the other residents think? Strange rituals. David repeated, his voice dangerously low. Are you referring to a 12-year-old dancing to make my daughter smile? Don't play innocent, Helena retorted, now filming again. You know exactly what you're doing. First you move here, then you start with these public demonstrations of difference. It's a strategy, isn't it? To normalize things that don't belong here. David felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just Helena's words, it was her tone, her posture, her absolute conviction that she was right. It was exactly what his grandfather Isaac had described about the neighbors in Berlin, when things began to subtly change. Mom says that some people get nervous when they see happy Jews, Eli whispered to Sophie, trying to explain the situation in a way that an 8-year-old could understand. She says it's not our fault, but that sometimes we have to be extra careful. Helena listened and her face contorted into an expression of perverse triumph. See, they even teach children to victimize themselves. David, are you really going to allow them to influence your daughter with that mentality? It was at that moment that David Goldman realized he wasn't just dealing with a difficult neighbor. Helena Morrison was something much more dangerous, someone who had found a socially acceptable way of expressing old hatred, disguising prejudice as concern for the neighborhood. Daddy, Sophie said softly, why is she being mean to Eli? He just wanted to make me happy. Helena overheard and immediately pointed the camera at Sophie. Look. They're already indoctrinating the child. David, your daughter is being emotionally manipulated by these people and you can't see it. David stepped forward, his intimidating presence making Helena recoil slightly. Take it off. That one. Camera. Off. My daughter. Now. I'm not going to do anything like that, Helena replied, but David noticed that her voice had lost some of its arrogance. I'm documenting inappropriate behavior on private property. I have every right. Inappropriate behavior? David repeated, his voice laden with a dangerous irony. A child dancing to make my paralyzed daughter smile is inappropriate behavior? Don't give me that, Helena snarled. You know very well it's not about dancing. It's about, well, you know what it's about. David knew exactly what it was about. And he knew that Helena was about to discover that she had chosen the wrong target for her hatred disguised as civic concern. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep and Eli had gone home, David stayed in his office until late. The walls were covered with diplomas, certificates and photos of construction projects that had transformed entire neighborhoods. But his attention was focused on a framed photo on the desk, his grandfather Isaac, a Bergen-Belsen survivor, holding a baby David on his lap. Never again, Isaac had whispered in David's ear when he was a child. Never again will we allow ourselves to be made victims in silence. David opened his laptop and started typing. First, he looked up Helena Morrison's complete history. He quickly discovered that she had moved into the condominium after being forced to sell her previous home due to a discrimination lawsuit against black tenants. Then he found her social media posts, years of coded comments about preserving the quality of the neighborhood and keeping certain people in their proper places. But what really caught her attention was a series of recent posts about how certain families were invading spaces traditionally reserved for good family people. Helena had been careful with her words, but the pattern was unmistakable. David smiled for the first time in hours. Helena Morrison had made the classic mistake of all prejudiced people. She assumed that her victim would be passive. She had no idea that David Goldman was not only a successful businessman, but someone who had built his empire specifically so that he would never have to accept this kind of treatment again. Every new snide remark Helena made only strengthened something inside him that she couldn't see, a determination forged by generations of survivors who had vowed never again to allow hatred to win without a fight. What that privileged woman didn't know was that every act of contempt was sealing her own fate, and that David Goldman had resources, patience and connections she could never have imagined. Each new spiteful comment Helena made only strengthened something inside him that she couldn't see, a determination forged by generations of survivors who had vowed never again to allow hatred to win without a fight. What that privileged woman didn't know was that every act of contempt was sealing her own fate, and that David Goldman had resources, patience and connections she could never have imagined. The next morning, Helena Morrison wasted no time. At 7 a.m., she was already posting on the condominium's WhatsApp group, "Guys, I need to talk about some inadequate behavior I witnessed yesterday. Certain families are allowing strange activities in the gardens. We can't accept this in our community." In less than an hour, the responses started pouring in. Most neighbors, knowing Helena's personality, responded with polite emojis or simply ignored her. But some took the bait. "What kind of activities, Helena?" asked Margaret Walsh, another resident known for her strong opinions on neighborhood standards. "Religious rituals in the garden, in broad daylight, with children taking part." Helena typed quickly. "David Goldman allows them to influence his disabled daughter with these traditions. I won't go into detail here, but you get the idea." David read each message with growing interest. Helena was documenting her own prejudice in text, creating evidence that she didn't even realize. Every "I agree" emoji she received from some of her neighbors was more ammunition. "Daddy," Sophie called from the window, "can Eli come and play today?" "Of course, darling," David replied, his voice carrying a calmness that contrasted with the storm brewing in his mind. "But today Dad will be in the garden too." At 10 o'clock, David made a phone call. "Marcus, I need you here. Today." Marcus Chun was more than a lawyer. He was the kind of professional that successful businessmen kept on speed dial for delicate situations. A specialist in civil rights and discrimination, Marcus had built a career destroying people who thought they were above the law. "Religious discrimination in a housing estate?" Marcus repeated, his voice already showing professional interest. "David, do you have any idea how big a hole this woman is digging for herself?" "I'm starting to," David replied. "But I want to make sure that when we act, it's final." Marcus arrived driving a black Tesla and carrying a leather briefcase. At 38, the Taiwanese-American lawyer had faced prejudice all his life and turned each experience into fuel for a career dedicated to making racists pay dearly for their actions. "Show me everything," said Marcus, opening his laptop in David's office. Together, they reviewed Helena's messages, her old social media posts, and began to document a clear pattern of discrimination. Marcus took precise notes, his legal mind already putting together a strategy. "David, this isn't just about you and your family," Marcus explained. "Helena Morrison represents something bigger. She's the kind of person who uses her privileged position to bully anyone who doesn't fit into her worldview." At 2 p.m., when Eli arrived to play with Sophie, Helena was recording again. From her backyard, she filmed every movement, every laugh, every moment of joy between the children. But this time, David was ready. "Marcus," he called softly, "she's filming." The lawyer discreetly positioned himself behind the window and began to document Helena documenting the children. "Unauthorized filming of minors on private property," he muttered, making notes. Helena, realizing she had a larger audience, decided to escalate the situation. "David," she shouted over the fence. "This situation has crossed the line. Either you stop it or I'll take action." David calmly walked over to the fence, with Marcus following close behind. "What kind of action, Helena?" "I've documented everything. I'll report you to the condominium management, the residents' association, and if necessary, the relevant authorities." Marcus stepped forward, introducing himself with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Marcus Chun, a lawyer specializing in civil rights. Could you repeat exactly what you just said about reporting a family for practicing religious activities?" Helena paled slightly, but her arrogance overcame her caution. "I don't care who you are. This neighborhood has standards. What specific standards would a Jewish family be violating? Marcus asked, his voice cutting. It's not about religion. It's about proper behavior. Noisy rituals, inappropriate influence on a vulnerable child. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that precedes devastating victories. Ms. Morrison, you just admitted, in front of witnesses, that you consider Jewish religious practices to be inappropriate rituals. Would you care to clarify? Helena realized she had fallen into a trap, but her pride was greater than her prudence. I'm not going to retract. I'm entitled to my opinions and I won't be intimidated by you. David watched Marcus take more notes, turning a neighborly argument into a solid case of documented discrimination. That night, after Sophie had gone to sleep, David and Marcus reviewed all the material they had collected. Hours of recordings, dozens of discriminatory messages, witnesses, and now, recorded admissions of religious prejudice. David, Marcus said, closing his laptop, in my 20-year career, I've rarely seen anyone build such a solid case against themselves. Helena Morrison didn't just discriminate against her family, she did it publicly, repeatedly, and documented it all. David nodded, a dangerous calm in his eyes. How long do we need to completely destroy the life she built based on privilege and prejudice? Marcus smiled. 2 weeks. What Helena Morrison didn't know was that David Goldman had spent the last few days activating a network of contacts she hadn't even imagined existed. Influential businessmen, community leaders, journalists, people who had also grown up hearing stories about what happens when hate is not confronted. While she thought she was intimidating a vulnerable family, she had actually declared war on an entire community that was just waiting for the opportunity to show that they would never allow themselves to be victimized in silence again. What Helena Morrison didn't know was that David Goldman had spent the last few days activating a network of contacts that she hadn't even imagined existed. Influential businessmen, community leaders, journalists, people who had also grown up hearing stories about what happens when hate is not confronted. While she thought she was intimidating a vulnerable family, she had actually declared war on an entire community that was just waiting for the opportunity to show that they would never allow themselves to be victimized in silence again. Monday arrived like any other for Helena Morrison. She had her gourmet coffee, checked her social media, and got ready for another day of community watch. But when she opened the condominium's WhatsApp, something was different. Helena, we need to talk. Emergency meeting today at 7 p.m. in the condominium hall. Subject: inappropriate behavior by residents. The message was signed by David Goldman, but sent by the official administration. Helena smiled. Finally, someone had taken action on that Jewish situation. She didn't even realize that her enthusiastic response, "Finally, it's about time someone took action on certain inappropriate influences," had been screenshot instantly. At 7 p.m., Helena entered the hall expecting to find a small gathering of neighbors supporting her position. Instead, she found the hall packed. Not just with residents of the condominium, but with people she didn't recognize. Lawyers, journalists, community leaders, and in the front row, Rachel Cohen, Rabbi and Eli's mother. "Good evening, Helena," David said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "Thank you for accepting our invitation to clarify your public statements about inappropriate influences in our community." It was at this moment that Helena realized she had fallen into a trap. Marcus Chun stood up, connecting his laptop to the projector. "Before we begin, I'd like to show you some evidence that has been collected over the last few days." The first image that appeared on the screen was Helena's WhatsApp screenshot, religious rituals in the garden, in broad daylight. David Goldman allows them to influence his disabled daughter with these traditions. A murmur went through the room. Helena tried to interrupt. "That's out of context. I was just worried about neighborhood standards." Marcus continued, moving on to the next slide. "Like in this recording from yesterday." Helena's voice echoed through the hall. "I won't retract. I'm entitled to my opinions and I won't be intimidated by you." Helena paled. She had been recorded without knowing it. Or perhaps you'd prefer to explain these Facebook posts from the last 2 years. Marcus continued relentlessly. On the screen appeared screenshots of Helena's posts about preserving the quality of the neighborhood and keeping certain people in their proper places. I never mentioned religion specifically." Helena tried to defend herself, but her voice was shaking. David stood up calmly. "You're right, Helena. You were very careful never to use directly discriminatory words. But as a businessman, I've learned that patterns reveal intentions better than single words." Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing a meticulously prepared graph. In the last 3 years, since she moved here, Helena Morrison has made 47 official complaints against residents. 89% of these complaints were against the only 3 non-white families in the condominium. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Helena tried to speak, but Marcus continued. Of the 23 white families who violated the same rules on noise, gardening, and use of common spaces, Helena Morrison made exactly 0 complaints. That's a coincidence," Helena shouted, but her voice sounded desperate even to herself. Rachel Cohen stood up. "Mrs. Morrison, my 12-year-old son came home crying for the first time since we moved here. Not because he was rejected by a child, but because an adult made him feel that his religion, his culture, his very existence was inadequate." Helena tried one last defense. "I'm not anti-Semitic. I have Jewish friends." David smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting. Marcus, could you show us what we found out about Helena's Jewish friends?" A social investigation report appeared on the screen. Helena Morrison was fired from her previous job at the marketing firm Sterling & Associates after an internal lawsuit for religious discrimination against 3 Jewish employees. The case was settled out of court with compensation of $150,000. The silence in the room was deafening. Helena was visibly shattered, realizing that her entire past life had been investigated and exposed. "And here's the most interesting part," Marcus continued. "The company that fired her? One of the subsidiaries of the Goldman Construction Group. Small world, isn't it, Helena?" Helena Morrison finally understood the magnitude of her situation. She hadn't just attacked a random Jewish family, she had attacked the family of someone who not only had the resources to defend themselves, but had access to information that she thought would be buried forever. David addressed her directly. "Helena, you tried to use my disabled daughter as a justification for your prejudice. You tried to turn the first joy she had felt in 2 years into something dirty and inappropriate. That wasn't just anti-Semitism, it was pure cruelty." Margaret Walsh, the neighbor who had supported Helena on WhatsApp, got up and left the hall without saying a word. Other neighbors who had reacted positively to Helena's messages also began to leave, clearly embarrassed. The president of the condominium, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Helena Morrison, based on the evidence presented and in clear violation of the harmonious coexistence clauses of our bylaws, you have 30 days to leave the condominium." Helena tried to protest, but her voice wouldn't come out. She had lost not only her home, but her reputation, her community, and any pretense of moral superiority she thought she possessed. David approached her, his voice low but firm. "My daughter asked why you were being mean to her friend. Today she will understand that sometimes hurt people try to hurt others, but that there are always consequences for cruelty." As Helena Morrison collected the wreckage of her carefully constructed life, she finally understood a fundamental truth. She had completely underestimated not only David Goldman, but an entire community that had learned, through generations of persecution, that the best defense against hatred is not passivity, but the relentless exposure of the truth. And at that moment, as she walked through the hall towards the door, surrounded by the condemning stares of people who had once respected her, Helena discovered that some battles are not won by those who shout loudest, but by those who document best. As Helena Morrison collected the wreckage of her carefully constructed life, she finally understood a fundamental truth. She had completely underestimated not only David Goldman, but an entire community that had learned, through generations of persecution, that the best defense against hatred is not passivity, but the relentless exposure of the truth. And at that moment, as she walked through the hall towards the door, surrounded by the condemning stares of people who once respected her, Helena discovered that some battles are not won by those who shout loudest, but by those who document best. 6 months later, the contrast couldn't have been starker. David Goldman was in his office, signing the contract for the biggest project of his career, the construction of a multicultural community center that would be financed by a coalition of Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and ethnic businessmen who had been inspired by his story. The project would employ more than 200 people and include a special wing for the therapy of children with disabilities. "Daddy, look what I've done." Sophie literally ran, into the office. Over the last few months, Working with Eli and inspired by her newfound confidence, she had regained partial movement in her legs. It wasn't a medical miracle, but the result of determination, intensive therapy, and above all, the joy of having a friend who never saw her as limited. Eli was right behind, now attending the same private school as Sophie, on a full scholarship sponsored by the Goldman Foundation, newly created to support talented children from low-income families, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. "Mr. Goldman," Eli said, formal as ever, "my mother told me to thank you again for the opportunity at the synagogue. She never imagined she'd be able to direct the choir." Rachel Cohen had been hired as music director of the most prestigious Reform synagogue in the city, after David had discreetly mentioned her talent to some influential contacts. A small revenge against those who tried to silence the culture that Helena despised so much. On the other side of town, Helena Morrison was living a very different reality. After being evicted from her condominium, she found that getting a new place to live was surprisingly difficult. The story of her public exposure had spread on local social networks, and quality landlords simply had no availability when she came forward. Her divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier. Richard Morrison, a multinational company executive, could not afford to be associated with someone publicly identified as prejudiced. The division of assets was not generous, especially after some of his anti-Semitic comments were discreetly shared with his company's human resources department. Helena now lived in a small apartment in the suburbs, working as a freelance marketing consultant for small businesses, a considerable drop from her former position at a prestigious agency. Her old friends from the tennis club had gradually stopped answering her messages. The irony was that she had become exactly what she had always despised, a person struggling to maintain social relevance, viewed with suspicion by neighbors who knew her history. At the inauguration party for the community center, David was invited to speak. Hundreds of people were present: businessmen, politicians, religious leaders from different communities, families who would benefit from the programs. "A year ago," David began, "my daughter laughed for the first time since her accident, thanks to the kindness of a 12-year-old boy who just wanted to make her smile. A neighbor decided that this joy was inappropriate for our neighborhood." The audience listened in respectful silence. "She didn't know she was giving me a gift. Her intolerance reminded me of something my grandfather always said: the best response to hate is not more hate, it's to build something so beautiful that it makes the darkness irrelevant." Sophie and Eli were in the front row, wearing the center's official t-shirts. Sophie in her wheelchair decorated with colorful stickers, Eli next to her holding her friend's hand. Two children who had become unwitting symbols of how genuine friendship overcomes any prejudice. "This center," David continued, "doesn't exist despite the prejudice we face. It exists because of it. Every act of intolerance that has tried to diminish us has only strengthened our resolve to build something greater." Marcus Chun, now the Foundation's official lawyer, applauded from the audience. He had used Helena's case as a precedent in 3 other discrimination cases, winning all of them. David concluded, "Helena Morrison tried to teach us that certain people don't belong in certain places. Instead, she taught us that people like her don't belong anywhere where human dignity is valued." The ovation was long and heartfelt. But the most touching moment came afterwards, when a reporter asked Sophie how she felt. "My friend Eli taught me that dancing doesn't have to be with your feet," she replied, swiveling her chair gracefully. "And my dad taught me that winning doesn't mean hurting the people who hurt you, it means building something so beautiful that they realize how wrong they were." 6 months after that confrontation in the garden, David Goldman had turned a moment of hatred into a platform for social change. Helena Morrison had lost not only her home and status, but any pretense of moral superiority. The best revenge, David discovered, was not to destroy Helena Morrison. It was to prove that a Jewish child dancing for a paralyzed girl was exactly the kind of joy the world needed to see more of, not less. And as Sophie and Eli continued to dance, she in her chair, he at her side, everyone around them could see that some victories are so complete that they turn even hatred into fuel for something beautiful. Sometimes the most powerful justice is not to punish those who harm us, but to build a world so full of light that its darkness simply becomes irrelevant. If this story of how prejudice can awaken forces greater than hatred itself has inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true revenge is always the success our enemies could never have imagined.